Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Lila. I am the events manager and a co-owner at Porter Square Books. We're really grateful to have you here tonight, as well as, of course, tonight's guests, Frank Wilczek and Steven Pinker, here to discuss Fundamentals 10 Keys to Reality. A lot is happening in our country and our world these days, and I want to acknowledge that while also expressing how glad I am that we can take an hour to be together tonight, even if it is virtually, to listen and learn about this really fascinating topic. So I hope that you know us already, but Porter Square Books is an independent and employee-owned bookstore in Cambridge, Mass, located on the traditional and unceded land of the Wampanoag people. For the safety of our staff and our community, we're actually closed for in-store browsing right now while Massachusetts COVID cases continue to rise, but our website is open 24/7 and we continue to offer curbside pickup, local delivery, and multiple shipping options to mail out books nationwide, so you can definitely still get all the books you need. So please do check us out at portersquarebooks.com. We really appreciate your support of us in this very strange time. We also have a ton more great virtual events planned throughout the month and beyond. There's something on the schedule for every kind of reader, but if you are the kind of person who loves a sweeping science narrative, I suggest that you join us on January 28th, that's a Thursday, with Dr. Paul Farmer, the founder of Partners in Health, for a talk on his new book, Fevers, Feuds, and Diamonds, which chronicles the Ebola epidemic from a reporting and sociological perspective and highlights the public health takeaways that we should learn from. So please do check out our full events calendar again on portersquarebooks.com to learn more about that event or one of our many others. We hope that we will see you again. I just have a few quick housekeeping notes, and then I promise we are going to get to the good stuff tonight. First of all, this event is going to be recorded, so you can watch it back if you can only stay for part of tonight's talk, or if you want to share it with a friend. It'll be right here at the same link for you, as well as on our Facebook page. A lot of you have already found our lovely chat window open on the bottom right of your screen where it says, say something nice. So please do, you can type in there and say hello, maybe let us know where you're watching from. Of course, we do expect you to keep it respectful, and we reserve the right to remove anybody who's not maintaining that standard. So right next to that little chat box on the bottom of your screen, you'll see the words ask a question, and you can type in there or in the chat any questions you might have for tonight's guests, and we will take a look at those towards the end of the event. This is also live streaming to Facebook, so hello Facebook. Just so you know, we can't see your questions or comments over on Facebook, so if you do want to participate, you can come join us directly here on Crowdcast. The link is right in the video description. And then finally, I'd like to call your attention to this really very important green button. It's sort of in the middle bottom of your screen, right below where I'm speaking, where it says Order Fundamentals from Porter Square Books. And that is indeed where you can purchase your copy or copies of the book right from our website. We have a ton of books in stock that we are more than happy to ship out for you. You can come pick it up. I think we might even be getting some signed book plates from Frank. So if you want a signed book, you can put that in your order comments. We'll figure that out. And again, we really thank you for your support this evening. Now, I promise that is almost all of the boring introduction stuff, and we are almost to the good part of this evening. Tonight, we're really pleased to welcome Frank Wilczek for his new book, Fundamentals, 10 Keys to Reality, joined in conversation by Steven Pinker. Fundamentals has already received high praise from scientific experts down to lay readers. Scientific American called it a lucid and riveting narrative of the fundamentals. The Washington Post described the guiding voice as clear and joyful. And Kirkus Reviews wrote that Wilczek invites us to be born again into a richer, deeper understanding of the world. Frank Wilczek won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2004 for work he did as a graduate student. He was among the earliest MacArthur Fellows and has won many awards both for his scientific work and his writing. He's the author of A Beautiful Question, The Lightness of Being, Fantastic Realities, Longing for the Harmonies, and hundreds of articles in leading scientific journals. His Wilczek's Universe column appears regularly in the Wall Street Journal, and Wilczek is the Hermann Feshbach Professor of Physics at MIT, founding director of the T.D. Lee Institute and chief scientist at the Wilczek Quantum Center in Shanghai, China, and a distinguished professor at Arizona State University and Stockholm University. Steven Pinker is a Johnstone family professor in the Department of Psychology at Harvard University. He conducts research on language and cognition, writes for publications such as the New York Times, Time, and The Atlantic, and is the author of 10 books, including The Language Instinct, How the Mind Works, The Blank Slate, The Stuff of Thought, and most recently, Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. So thank you both for being here this evening. I know we're all really looking forward to this conversation, so I'm going to let you two get to it. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Lila, and hi, Frank.
Hi, Steve.
We were colleagues for many years at MIT, but we still see each other in Cambridge.
Yeah,
and I'm glad we had this opportunity.
In a very special way.
Yeah. Let me say, the first thing that I liked about your book was on the very first page, when you said, talking about the readership of the book, they have intelligence but not knowledge. And I particularly like that because for me, it resonated with my own attitude in writing books, as you do for not just our academic peers, but for a wide audience. And I know the first advice that I got from a university press editor many decades ago, when I first decided to try to cross over, she said the mistake a lot of academics make is either they think they're writing for their peers and they leave everyone behind, or they condescend. They think they're writing for simpletons. She said the way you should not think that you are writing for a proverbial chicken plucker or truck driver. You're writing for someone who is as smart as you are, like your college roommate, who just doesn't know what you know. And then when I wrote a book on writing, and the advice that I began with was that you always have to imagine who you're talking to, since you years before are clicking words into a computer. Someone you've never met is picking up the book and opening it up. Yes. What's going on in your head? And the model for good writing, I think, is to think that you are conversing with a peer who hasn't seen what you have seen. You have to point it out in the world. And so I was very pleased to see that on your first page. And indeed, the book it's a lovely experience. Because you feel smarter reading it, you feel neither baffled nor condescended to. So I just want to express my appreciation.
Yes, I had very specific friends of mine in mind as I was writing this book that are lawyers and doctors and business people, people in the communications field, and they're very, very smart people. They're just as smart as my colleagues at MIT. And very curious, and that was a real inspiration to me in writing this book. And then the other person I had in mind as I wrote it was myself as a teenager, and then in the future my grandson. Because my grandson was born as I was writing, and I was thinking very much about what he would hope. I would hope that he will enjoy it in the future.
Well, it shows, because it is it's lucid and fascinating. So I thought, what should we talk about? You're a physicist. I'm a cognitive psychologist. One place in which our interests, oddly enough, intersect, and you point this out early on in the book. I am interested in the human conception of space and time and matter and causality. And you note that being born again by learning physics consists of learning a second time about these fundamental constituents.
Yes.
I wrote a book called The Stuff of Thought, and one of the chapters was on people's naive mental models of space-time, causality, and matter.
Yes,
I thought maybe it would be fun if I threw out a couple of observations about how space and time and causality and matter are coded in language. What's the kind of intuitive physics behind the English language, and then perhaps we could compare it with the state of the art in modern physics. So, should we start with space?
You want me? I'm sorry.
No, I'll start with. I'll start with that.
You're loading up. Okay, good.
So a few things about the spaces is mainly coded in English in prepositions. The book is on the table. I threw the ball to my friend. The needle went through the cloth, and so on. So these are the little words that that code our conception of space. And there is a kind of peculiar geometry or physics in the English language. For one thing, the space is kind of digitized. Things are, we don't express analog distance or orientation. I mean, we can if we use words like 3.79 inches, but if you actually look at the machinery of language, it makes binary digital distinctions like near, far, on, off, in, out, rather than a continuous analog conception. It's relative, so we use the same prepositions for any scale. We can say the ant walked across his hand, the bus drove across the country, the beam of light went across the universe, I suppose, and it's the same across. Our conception of space is schematic, so we idealize objects as having a certain number of dimensions, and we conceptualize them as if the some dimensions are there and some dimensions aren't. So, for example, we have a word like line for a one-dimensional entity. Road is infinite in one dimension, but fixed in a second dimension and no third dimension. A surface is unbounded in two dimensions, and a slab is unbounded in two dimensions with a little bit of thickness.
Okay.
But we don't, even though everything is three-dimensional, we don't talk about, say, a wire as a long, skinny cylinder. It's as if its thickness doesn't exist, or a DVD, it's not a short, flat cylinder. It's as if that thickness doesn't exist in our minds. So those are just a few properties of space as we talk about it, and perhaps you could say something about space as it's now conceived of in physics.
Okay, so let me put this in context. Babies, when they're organizing their sensory experience, face a very big challenge. The sensory experience is, from the point of view of modern fundamental understanding, for instance, in vision, you collect photons through little tiny openings in your eye. They arrive at the back of the retina, which is a two-dimensional screen, and then you get electrical impulses. And somehow, from that raw information, with things overlapping each other, very confused, and the dimensionality collapsed, you face the question of how to get around in the world, how to construct the world that we know in everyday life, which is three-dimensional, obeys laws of Euclidean geometry if we want to move around, but projective geometry if we want to know how things will look. And it's an insolvable problem, really. We develop lots of rules of thumb and ways of understanding that there are objects with more or less permanent properties that can move around freely in space. And have many of these intermediate concepts that you mentioned, that language encodes that, implicitly. The goal of physics, fundamental physics, is to do justice to a very different sensory universe. It's the same universe, but perceived very differently, with any and all tools we can bring to bear, that including things like microscopes, telescopes, spectrometers, magnetometers, compasses, and we derive then a sort of, and the goal of our description is to be accurate, to be faithful to all those observations. And also, it's been remarkably fruitful to try to make the description as compact as possible, to really strip it down to axioms, if you like, a few salient features that result from the analysis, and then build up from those basic features, build the world back up. And so it's a very different language. It's not natural language. It's the language of, it turns out, mathematics and logic. And this can be, of course, explained at very different levels. But I think the take-home message that is easily summarized nowadays is that you can write the fundamental operating system of the world in terms that a computer could understand, just zeros and ones, and you wouldn't even need a very long program. It would be a program that would be small compared to DOS even, let alone a modern operating system or Word. And you could faithfully represent the basic laws from which, if you unfolded it, you would reproduce the world as we know it, we think. And we have a lot of evidence that works. Of course, to achieve that, you have that miracle of compression. You have to use concepts and a kind of language that's been honed over centuries that allows a lot of logical processing, and that's very different, obviously, from the concepts we use to describe the rules of thumb that we develop as babies to get around in the world. And so that's why I speak of the process of being born again. You have, if you really want to understand the fundamental description that science provides of the world, based on very different tools and also logical thinking and this drive to boil things down, make it more exact and more compact, it's a different language, and it's strikingly different. It doesn't resemble any natural language whatsoever, really.
Well, let me switch to time and perhaps give you an observation that might be perhaps
time is interesting too.
The most dramatic contrast between our conception of a fundamental and modern physics conception of it. The most salient aspect of time in language, of course, is tense, and we trichotomize the timeline into past, present, and future. The present is kind of a moving 3-second window. William James called it the specious present.
Yes.
It's kind of the moment of consciousness, what we feel happens now. It's the duration of a handshake, of a line of poetry, of a musical motif, like, da 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 da. And that's what we mean by present. It's not an instant.
Yeah.
So it's a sliding window, but then
that's of course exploited in motion pictures, which are really a series of stills.
Indeed, the critical flicker frequency.
Right.
We except for the old Charlie Chaplin movies, we don't see it as flickering.
Yes.
But then everything that occurs before now all gets marked the same way. Walked. I like to quote Groucho Marx, who said to a hostess, "I've had a lovely evening, but this wasn't it." So everything prior to the moment of speaking is treated equivalently, but sharply distinguished from this moving 3-second window called now.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's this thing called the future. Not even a tense in English, because we have to use the auxiliary will to talk about it, which has this strange conflation between the timeline heading forward and a kind of volition, what we want to happen. So when Winston Churchill said, we shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall never surrender, it was not clear whether he was making a prediction or making a declaration, or they're kind of the same thing in that case.
Yes.
So perhaps you could say something about how you talk about time and in the book of how alien it is to, and how much of we have to be born again to grasp time as a physicist.
Yeah, the time that we actually use in our fundamental description of the world this is going to sound silly and circular, but it's the time measured by clocks. And what is a clock? And this is where it gets profound. There are many, many different things that you can use as clocks. You can use the sun as a clock, as ancient civilizations and astronomers did to mark the calendar. You can use the sun as a clock in sundials. You can use sand as a clock, and then eventually people got more sophisticated clocks based on pendula, and now shaking crystals, and the most accurate sophisticated clocks are based on shaking atoms. And the remarkable thing is that they all measure the same thing. They all are synchronized. You can measure each one, and the progress of each one goes in synchrony with the progress of any other one. That thing that they're all agreeing on is what in physics we call time. One of the profound, so that's profound. There's a fact about the world that we extract and call time. We use the same word as in common language, but of course the nuances and its precision is different, as in many cases in physics or science. When we talk about symmetry, when we talk about equality, we mean something more limited and yet more expansible when we use it in science. The thing about so there is this common time, and the other fantastic fundamental fact that science reveals that it's easy to take for granted now, but was and is a great discovery, is that the fruitful way to state the fundamental laws is as rules for what happens next. So our equations, since Newton's laws of motion and gravity were sort of the original modern model that's for science, that's taken over all of physics, is that the simple regularities, the universal laws, are all statements about what happens next. So they relate one time to another time. And so we need a more, to do justice to that, we need to make finer subdivisions than just past, present, and future by far. There are very strange aspects of time also that I'll just mention. We could expand on them if you like, which is that time has two fundamental symmetries as understood in our basic science. One is what we call time translation symmetry, which is the statement that if you move time along by a constant in your mind, you will find the same laws. So the laws stay the same even if you make that change in the origin of time. And that's also known as the laws are eternal. They don't change. The other is time reversal symmetry, which is a very strange one that says that the basic laws of physics are very different from our experience. They have the property that if you run them backwards in time, they're almost exactly the same. We thought they were exactly the same until 1964, when some obscure experiments found a violation of that. But it's an amazing fact that's very different from our experience of the world, but very closely true in our fundamental understanding that the laws run almost the same forwards and backwards. So if you took a movie of subatomic events or events where friction doesn't play an important role and ran it backwards, it would still obey the laws of physics, even though if you run a Charlie Chaplin movie backwards, it looks very, very unreal. Understanding and unraveling those symmetries has been a very great adventure that's leading us in new directions and made unexpected connections. As I describe in the book, it even gives us hints about what the dark matter of the universe might be.
Well, let me probe the
Right.
difference between our intuitions and the
Yes.
picture of time that you just given. I'll mention two things that
Yes.
sound kind of bizarre from the human's perspective. Our first experience with the world. One of them is there's no, if I understand it, the notion of now versus present versus past doesn't really have any physical content in physics, right?
Yes.
Present is just a psychological phenomenon. There's no such thing as the physics of now.
There's not a universal now. We don't need it. Let me put it that way. And if we pretend there is a universal now, we don't get as elegant a formulation of the basic laws as if we are flexible about what we mean by now. This is a feature of that really emerged clearly in the special theory of relativity, where you find that the physical laws, the basic fundamental physical laws, look the same to someone who's moving along at a constant velocity as to someone who's on a stationary platform. And however, if you want to rewrite the laws of the stationary platform in terms of the moving platform, or vice versa, you have to use different notions of time. And events which occurred at the same time, according to one observer, are not occurring at the same time, according to the other person's definition of time. A simple way of seeing why there are difficulties in defining a universal time is that you would, what would you mean to say, okay, that's happening that's happening now. You have to be able to, you have to be able to communicate instantaneously in order to say, I'm seeing what's happening there now. But our fundamental laws, which are related to this relativity principle, say that the influences can propagate at most as fast as the speed of light. So you just can't synchronize everywhere.
But let me push that a couple of things.
Yeah.
Let's not even talking about the different nows for different observers or different frames of reference. Even my now, in terms of the past is behind me, the future is yet to be determined. Right now, I'm being here now, as Baba Ramdas used to say in the 60s. But as I understand it, in modern physics, now means as much as here. That is, doesn't mean anything. It's just a psychological kind of egocentric vantage point. And if considering time to be the fourth dimension,
yes.
There's no boundary in terms of the mental model of me kind of proceeding along the timeline. I'm always at the present, and the past is always behind me, the future always ahead of me.
Yes.
Am I right in thinking that in physics that makes as little sense as saying that here is a special place because I happen to be here now?
Well, it's special to you, or special to me, where we are. So it makes sense to say an event is happening at a certain place in space and time. However, because of the homogeneity of space and the time translation symmetry, or the homogeneity of time, there's no intrinsic marker that we know of that tells you a distinction between different places or different times. So space-time is a vast structure, not a void, by the way, but a very rich structure with material that should be thought of as a material that's very uniform. So it's not like the medieval concept of the world where there was a center of the universe, which happened to be hell, but there's no center that we can tell. There's no preferred position, but of course, to any particular observer, there is a preferred position, which is where I am, or where you are if you're the observer. One thing I should say about the speed of light, just to bring it home, kind of, as babies, we get mixed up about now because the speed of light is so fast that we don't see the delays. But with modern technology, if the world were a little bigger and I were talking to you on the other side of the world, there could be noticeable delays because it takes a while for the signal to get there and then come back. And it's sort of a close thing with the size of the Earth as we actually have it. If you're communicating with Shanghai, the delays are a significant fraction of a second, so almost perceptible. If you wanted to proceed to communicate with someone on the moon, you'd have to wait. It would be a slow conversation, and that would really bring home the idea that what the person on the moon thinks of as now is not what we're thinking of as now, and there's a kind of mismatch. in a sense, we see their past and they see our past. Right? And that's,
let me press then on the reversibility of time, because that is the biggest challenge. Now, if we just were looking at a film of one billiard ball hitting another, and we ran it backwards, we couldn't tell forward from backwards.
Right.
But of course, if there was a triangle of balls and one hit it and they all scattered, you ran that backward and all of these billiard balls converge into a perfect triangle, and a ball rebounds off the apex. You know that film was run backwards.
You'd say that's quite a coincidence. You'd say there's quite a coincidence there. That's right.
Yeah. So can you say something about how you reconcile the statement that the laws of physics are the same forward and backwards in time, with the fact that Charlie Chaplin run backwards doesn't look like Charlie Chaplin? We can tell that it's run backwards.
Yes. There are two questions raised by this remarkable feature of physical law, which is, first of all, why it should be true, and then why it should be false. It's, as I said, it's almost true, which is something we really require explanation of in the fundamental laws. But the question you asked is also pertinent, and let me start with that one. It all goes back to the fundamental asymmetry of time, not in the basic physical laws, but in how they're realized in the universe. We have a lot of evidence that the universe began in a very different condition. We call it the Big Bang, when things were much hotter and denser, and we had the universe was filled with very hot, dense material that was expanding and cooling and condensing and forming the things we know as stars and planets eventually, and human beings. And it's a very rich, interesting, and well-documented story in its outlines. Now, if you imagine running that backwards, you got a big problem, it turns out, because if you run things backwards, take the world as we know it and run it backwards in time, if you make the slightest mistake in how things are arranged, what wants to happen as things get dense and close together is they want to form black holes. They want to agglomerate. Gravity wants to pull them together and make compact objects. But the Big Bang wasn't like that. The Big Bang was very uniform in matter. So that's where ultimately there's a big asymmetry in time between what you would get if you ran present universe back to the Big Bang, unless it was exactly just right, or what we actually observe. So, and your example of the billiard balls is perfect, because it shows that you had to have very, very special conditions in order to get simplicity out of an arbitrary initial state. It kind of requires a conspiracy. We have partial explanations of why that initial condition for the universe is what it is, but that's where all the time asymmetry ultimately comes from. It's unfolding this initial remarkable state, which is highly unstable, very, very special, that matter was almost uniformly distributed, even though gravity in equilibrium would want it to be all clumped up. So why did it start that way? That, in our modern fundamental understanding, if you trace it back far enough, and I'm not sure even all physicists realize this, but it's true. If you trace it back back far enough, all the observed manifestations of an arrow of time ultimately come from that cosmic asymmetry.
Well, let me again use language as a way to expose how our conception of physical reality differs from that of physics. I can use the word before as much as I want.
Yes.
What was before that? What was before the thing that was before that? Was the thing before was the thing before? You mentioned that the laws of the universe are independent of the exact moment of time. If something, if the law works now, it worked, the same way an hour ago and
Yes.
a year ago. But now let's say I ask the question. I can ask this question even though I know that within physics it's meaningless, but the English language allows me to ask it. So I'm going to ask it.
Okay, good.
What was it like 14 billion years ago before
the Big Bang?
Before
A little
Big
bit
Bang.
before the Big Bang.
Before the Big Bang. Is that a meaningful concept, even though I can say it?
You can say it, and you can ask it, but physics doesn't have a good answer for it, or really a good formulation of it. As I said, in physics, ultimately, we have two definitions of time which agree, which we use. One is that time is what clocks measure, and they all are consistent. And the other, which is really a recoding of the same answer, is that time is a quantity t, which occurs in all our equations, and there's just one of it. It's a dimension. It's like 3 dimensions of space that we sense, and all our laws, which are laws, as I said, for our basic laws, are laws for how things change, are phrased in terms of this t. Now, when you trace the laws that we have secure knowledge of, the fundamental laws, back towards more and more extreme conditions that they predict as you go towards this Big Bang. So things are running things backwards in time. They're getting denser and denser and hotter, and the gravitational forces are getting bigger and bigger. The equations eventually, about 13.8 billion years ago, turn into infinity equals infinity. They refuse to go any further. It's like a car that suddenly breaks down. We don't know how the equations don't work anymore. So we need better equations to really address that question. So we don't know. My favorite answer was actually an answer that was my best guess. Also, is an answer that was given by Saint Augustine originally. As he really, although he didn't put it exactly this way, he really championed the idea that time is what clocks measure. Because one of his parishioners was a troublemaker, something like you, who asked what was happening before God made the universe. And Augustine was tempted to say, creating hell for people who ask troublesome questions. He writes that in the Confession, but he said that didn't seem like a worthy answer that night. So he thought very hard about it, and there's a whole book of the Confessions devoted to this meditation on time. And what he ultimately came up with is the profound concept that time is no more and no less than what clocks measure. And since before God made the universe, there were no clocks, there was no time. And therefore, it doesn't make sense to ask what happened before. It appears to be a grammatical sentence that has a certain logic, but if you really scratch it hard, you see that there's nothing there under the surface.
Well, I'm reassured by that. When we were at both at MIT, we were both in the School of Science, but I was in the squishiest of the sciences, and you're in the heart. And it's long been a kind of a running joke in psychology that the definition of intelligence is whatever intelligence tests measure. And that's always been kind of embarrassment to the field. But I'm glad that time is what clocks measure.
Yeah,
and
well, okay. Well, in the case of time, there's a lot of lore that goes with that, as we've discussed, that all the measures are consistent, that you could do it in different ways, that the laws run on time. In intelligence, I guess that's more controversial, whether all possible intuitively appropriate measures of intelligence are the same thing as measured by intelligence tests. Of course, if you have the clear understanding that what you mean by intelligence is the thing measured by intelligence tests, and it's consistent across a broad spectrum, then you could try to promote that into a definition. Whether it's a useful one, that's a different issue.
Actually, we can do better in psychology than that, but
Right.
that's for my next book. Let me go back to change over time. And again, this will be the last parallel and non-parallel I'll draw between language and the intuitive physics baked into language and real physics. But we do have in language a very strong notion of causation. We make a difference between the ship sank and the ship was sunk. In one case, it just happened. The other case, there was a guy who did it. Now, I know there is a philosophy of science that says that causation is just a quirk of our psychology and it has no physical reality. Bertrand Russell said the concept of causality survives like the monarchy because people mistakenly think it does no harm. But was Russell going too far? Is there a notion of causality, or is it just a bunch of equations?
Oh, well, it's a bunch of equations, but there's a very useful definition of causality, which is, okay, as I said, the laws are laws of change. And there's also a very important feature called locality of our fundamental understanding of physical law, at least as it's developed, as presently developed, which is that it's closely related to the limiting speed, being the speed of light, means that what's happening at a particular place in space and time can be figured out by solving equations if you give me what happened in a certain region of the past. Everything you need to know is encoded in information that you can extract from the past. So that, whether you want to call that causality or not, I guess is a matter of semantics. It is commonly called causality in physics, and it may not agree with some philosophers' idea of what causality should be, but at least that's the thing that is true in modern physics and has been a very important guiding principle.
Okay, let me go back to time, because you did mention that what gives time an arrow is what happened at the Big Bang. Started off small, compact, homogeneous, then all hell broke loose.
So what we mean by the past is the direction of time that points toward the Big Bang.
Right, but presumably because everything kind of it blew apart, things got more dispersed and heterogeneity got magnified. And it ties, and I'm going to be very naive here, but it would seem to tie to the laws of thermodynamics, right?
Oh, yes.
That arrow of time. And so here's another question. The book is fundamentals, and it's got 10 chapters on kind of the most fundamental things we have to know. And there have been other books written by physicists on fundamentals, like Peter Atkins' 4 Laws That Drive the Universe. And in most of other physicists' inventories of what are the fundamentals, they almost all mention the laws of thermodynamics, especially the second law. And I'll read a little quote here as an example, if I can find it on my screen, where I think it was a famous quote by Arthur Eddington, which I'm sure you're familiar with. The law that entropy always increases holds, the law that entropy always increases holds, I think, the supreme position among the laws of nature. If someone points out to you that your pet theory of the universe is in disagreement with Maxwell's equations, then so much the worse for Maxwell's equations. If it is found to be contradicted by observation, well, these experimentalists do bungle things sometimes. But if your theory is found to be against the second law of thermodynamics, I can give you no hope. There is nothing for it but to collapse in deepest humiliation. But on the other hand, in fundamentals, you have one footnote in which you explain why you don't have thermodynamics, especially the law of entropy or the second law of thermodynamics, as one of your 10 chapters. So I thought maybe you could chat about that. And I had one more question.
I'm going to have to move a little bit because my computer's running out of juice.
Okay. Second law of thermodynamics. There you go.
Yes. well, also not having it plugged in. the,
Conservation of energy.
Well, what I mean by fundamentals is, for purposes of the book Fundamentals, I thought very hard about what I meant by fundamental. And what I mean is principles that cannot be explained, even in principle, in terms of other things. So there's no, this is as deep as it goes, so to speak. I mean, the second law of thermodynamics is not like that. It's it can be derived from other principles of physics, from the mechanical view of the world, if you like, and the laws. And really, it also, properly understood, brings in cosmology. It needs to, you need to explain why entropy is getting bigger instead of smaller if the fundamental laws are symmetric under the direction of time. And as we've been discussing, that ultimately traces back to the Big Bang, and the fact that we live in a very special state where you find a lot of materials that aren't in their highest possible entropy state. That is, they aren't in equilibrium yet, but they're sort of approaching equilibrium. I don't think it's, I mean, call me a dope, call me skeptical, call me whatever. I don't think it has the same, I would not be shocked if we find violations of the second law of thermodynamics when we understand the world more deeply. It's not clear to me that the Big Bang is the entire answer. There might be special conditions, special simplicities about the future also. There might be other kinds of matter whose time runs differently. So we'll see. I mean, we'll see. But the second law of thermodynamics to me is a derived principle, and it's very robust, of course, and it's been very useful in applications. But its basis in fundamentals is the other laws of mechanics and electrodynamics and so forth, and the statement that the states we find around us are typically not in, if they're not in equilibrium, probably they will approach equilibrium. And the fact that we can find systems that are not yet in equilibrium ultimately traces to the fact that the Big Bang was out of equilibrium. So, and if we change our picture of what the Big Bang was, or whether the Big Bang is the only source of simplicity in cosmic history, I wouldn't be surprised I wouldn't be shocked. I certainly wouldn't be ashamed if there are violations of the second law of thermodynamics that follow from some other profound idea.
I hope you have not emboldened all of the cranks in their designs for perpetual motion devices to the patent office.
Right.
Thinking, well, Wilczek says there might be a loophole.
Yeah.
Let me ask you one more question.
If there are loopholes, they're probably pretty hard to exploit.
Yeah. Let me ask one question. This one really pertains to more to your previous book than to this one, but it's also an area in which physics and psychology have make some contact, and that is on beauty. So we have the cliche, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and beauty is a topic in psychology. Why do we find certain faces attractive? Why do we find landscapes attractive? And it's easy to think that it is just a Darwinian adaptation for selecting a rich habitat, for finding a fertile and fit mate. I show my class a cartoon by Gary Larson. Shows a warthog in a bar and two other female warthogs. Oh
yes, I know that.
There he is, God's gift to warthogs. So, and as William James said, to the lion it is the lioness that is meant to be loved. To the bear, the she bear. Mm-hmm. So one could think that beauty is simply a quirk of our psychology, our wiring. But on the other hand, you, like many physicists, talk about, revere a certain kind of beauty in the laws of the universe. And even from the point of view of a psychologist, it is, I do find it peculiar that there are certain things that seem to transcend species. So the fact that the peacock it presumably looks beautiful to the peahen,
Yes.
but also to us.
Yes.
And butterflies and flowers, all these things that didn't evolve for the benefit of our visual system, they did evolve to look beautiful to some other organism, but also to us. So could you make any sense of the idea of aesthetic realism? That is, that beauty is actually an objective property of reality, not just in the eye of the beholder. And is it legitimate to guide?
I think. Well, the idea of beauty of equations or beauty of a physical description of the world, and the idea of beauty that we see in artistic expressions, especially decorative art and music, have significant overlaps. They certainly aren't the same thing. I mean, there are forms of beauty like sexual attraction, as you mentioned, that are not really features of physical law, as far as I know. But the ideas of symmetry, especially, that you can see the same thing from different perspectives and it stays the same and it will obey the same thing if it's in different places at different times. That patterns, if you see a pattern, it tends to continue regularly. These are very useful things in getting around in the world and are very helpful to babies solving the problem we mentioned very much earlier of constructing the physical world as we know it, or at least a working description, rules of thumb that will enable them to live and prosper based on a very difficult to interpret set of signals. So finding symmetry to be something that is attractive, that you want to exploit, want to experience, want to learn about, I think really is useful in the sense of evolution. And I think that's at least part of the reason for this extraordinary overlap between ideas of symmetry and beauty in physics and symmetry and beauty in art and decorative art and music and some other areas. Well, maybe, okay, I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Yeah, and there is a literature showing that even in sexual attraction, symmetrical faces are a bit more attractive than asymmetrical ones in general.
Okay.
So, but clearly, it's certainly true that when the visual system tries to make sense of the environment and find the objects and surfaces out there, symmetries, since they're improbable, they don't arise by chance, are a good cue that you're seeing something real out there.
And we fill things in. You know, if there's a blind spot, and we fill things in by assuming that they just continue.
We did, and I see our host has joined us.
Yes, this is so fascinating. I think we could continue to listen to you two chat, but I know that we have been getting some audience questions, so I thought we could just take a look at a couple of those before we close for the evening. And thank you, everyone. These are great questions. There's some really big questions here and some really specific ones. So maybe we'll start with one of the bigger ones first. This question is from David, who has a quote from Carl Sagan, who starts with, the truth may be puzzling. We have a method, and that method helps us to reach not absolute truth, only asymptotic approaches to the truth, never there, just closer and closer. So the question is science asymptotic, and is all reason, and what are the sort of implications of this limitation?
Okay, so I can say a few words about that. So we arrived at a remarkable place, I think, in fundamental understanding towards the end of the 20th century, where we now have a very compact, very difficult to change, very successful quantitatively and precise description of matter, where matter includes everything that you encounter in biology, chemistry, geology, almost all of astrophysics, apart from the very early universe and the interior of black holes, and all forms of engineering, that has reached asymptopia, I would say, or pretty nearly. We have the foundations, but to me, another feature of scientific exploration is that great questions lead to great, I'm sorry, great answers lead to great questions. So we can now formulate questions and hope to answer them that we could barely even formulate before. Now we can formulate them precisely and attempt to answer them. So, okay, so if we understand that, we understand what matter is in this profound way, and we think maybe that mind emerges from matter, now time to put up or shut up. Show how molecularly, at the molecular level, from equations and quantum mechanics, mind emerges. Where am I in those equations? I think that's a fantastic question and challenge, and we haven't reached that. We certainly haven't reached asymptopia there. And we should also recognize that science has some intrinsic limitations. I think, I don't know if Steve will completely agree with this, but I think science, which deals with questions of the grammatical form is, cannot really address questions of ought or good, which have a different grammar and really need different concepts. Science can, of course, inform the choices you make and tell you their hidden implications that you can make better, wiser choices, but ultimately there's an element of judging good and bad, or what ought to be, that science cannot do. And then the other limitation is a practical one, but so profound that it might as well be a matter of principle, which is that, first of all, quantum mechanical uncertainty, and then the so-called sensitivity to initial conditions, or chaos, means that although we have the equations, you cannot know in a practical way the state of the world well enough to unfold their consequences. And so we need contingent facts about the world as we actually see it, and intermediate concepts in order to flesh out our description of the world. Example I like to give is that the history of Sweden or the history of England is more complicated than the history of the universe, because we ask different kinds of questions and have different standards.
That was a great answer to, again, a really big question. So, okay, how about this one, which is a little bit more specific, which is Rohit asks about the chronology protection conjecture and whether you think that we're any closer to deciding its fate.
Okay, this is a little technical. Well, let me just note that the word conjecture appears in there. So yeah, so it's a conjecture. It's also, I think, difficult to even formulate in the context of quantum mechanics. So I don't like it, and I don't think it's a central question in understanding the world. So, kind of, it's a catchy name for a hypothesis that may or may not be true and may or may not be relevant to anything. All right.
All right, how about we end on this sort of last question, which maybe you both can sort of chime in on, from Srinath, which is, have you thought about self-evident truths as a complement or not, to empirical truths and mathematically verifiable truths?
Steve, do you want to take that one?
I'm tempted to quote or to paraphrase the late philosopher Hilary Putnam. What's self-evident isn't self-evident.
That's great. Yes.
I mean, all people are created. Well, Jefferson said all men are created equal.
Yeah.
By today's lights, that's not self-evident. He should have said all humans.
Yeah. I mean, people at one time thought that Euclidean geometry was self-evident. I mean, it's such a beautiful structure. Now we know that it's a beautiful axiomatic structure when refined, but its application to the world is contingent, and we need, and our modern fundamental science uses richer concepts of geometry routinely. Now, you might make a case that the principles of abstract logic or the principles of arithmetic are self-evident. Maybe.
There are.
Maybe.
Well, I mean, I think there is something to that in the sense that the very fact that we're even asking these questions
Yes.
and giving answers that would conform to the rules of logic mean that they are kind of baked in a way that other things aren't. Although if they're not evident in the sense that we believe in them, we use them, we can't get out of them.
They're evident in a kind of anthropic sense that if we don't use them, we can't get very far. Right?
Exactly. Yes. So maybe that's what self-evident means.
And so forth. You know what they say: lose it until you use it, or you lose it if you don't. So if you don't, so if you start to question the basic principles of logic, well, that way lies madness. I think.
Yeah. What are you questioning? Yes.
Right.
This has been such a fascinating conversation, and I want to remind everybody here who is intrigued by this talk that there is a whole book for you to explore full of more great things to ponder over, turn over, question. And again, you can pick up your copy of Fundamentals. It's right at this green button. It's sort of right below our faces. It says Order Fundamentals from Porter Square Books, and we are happy to get that for you. If you're local, if you're not local, we're happy to ship it. So again, I want to give a really big thanks to Frank and to Stephen for giving a great moderation from that squishy perspective, which I really appreciate as a squishy person. This has been so fascinating. So thank you both.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, I think we really did bridge the two worlds. Okay.
I hope so. And thanks, Lila. Thanks, Porter Square Books.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks, everyone. And we'll see you again in Cambridge one day, I hope, once we can do that all again.
I hope so.
All right. Thanks, everybody, and good night.
Good night.
Okay.